I'm sorry, it went out again, so I'm back. Um, so I was just talking about the radical poverty that um, both Francis and Claire embraced. Um, so, so we have to understand where they're coming from, and this is where they came from. They came from a life of privilege, and they wanted to just really embrace the life of Jesus. It was very unusual at the time for this type of life to occur. There were monasteries at the time, but in Claire's case, all of the monasteries that had women in them who had nuns were actually noble women. And the noble women that were in the monasteries, Benedictine and other monasteries, lived a very posh life. They had servants, they had, very sumptuous clothing, probably velvets and everything else. And they had a lot of food. So they were not really impoverished or put out in any way. They basically led the same life that they did when they were out of the convent. It's just that now they were not going to marry, they were not going to engage in anything but probably prayer and reading and maybe some needlework or something like that. So, this is the way the monasteries were set up at the time. When Claire wanted to embrace poverty, her monastery would be set up entirely different, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I said to you that basically it was hard for me to grasp at the beginning the poverty of Claire. But as I said last week, and I think the week before that even, and since the beginning, Claire's whole life was a life of love. Everything that Claire did in her life, everything that happened regarding her being a nun, was out of love. She had a love relationship with God, and she believed God had a love relationship with her. So when you look at it that way, and I think we talked and touched about this a little bit last week, out of this total love and this love relationship comes trust. A total trust. A total trust in God, that God would provide all of your needs, provide for all of your needs. That God loved you, would not let you suffer, be without food, be without basic sustenance like water and a roof over your head, that He would provide for all of your needs. Like Jesus said in the Gospels, He would say, don't worry about, what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear. Look at the lilies of the field and how the Father clothes them and provides for them, and the birds of the air. So Claire took that literally. She took God as a father, looked to Jesus as her love, the love of her life, and that He would not forsake or fail her. So it wasn't that they wanted to embrace poverty for poverty's sake. They wanted to embrace poverty as an example of complete trust. That they would rely completely on the Father, Mother, God, on Jesus Christ to provide everything that they needed. So this was the radical poverty, and they felt that if they did anything less than that, it would kind of show a distrust of God. It would show that God didn't love them the way they professed, and they didn't profess to love God the way they should. So that's what this radical poverty comes out of. It comes out of this complete trust and this complete love of God. So when you look at it that way, you think to yourself, how could it be anything different than that? If they were going to follow Christ and His way of life, if they were going to trust in God as a loving Father, then they would have to embrace total poverty. And that is a total, when I say poverty, it's a total detachment from things, a total detachment from even the outcome of anything. It's a total detachment from possessions and the mainstay and the money and everything of this world, and it's entering into a life of total love and trust. And from that, it freed them up totally, because they didn't have to worry about anything anymore. They didn't have to worry about what they were going to eat, like Jesus said in the Gospels, what they were going to wear. They didn't have to worry about what food they were going, like I said, what food was going to be provided for them, what place they were going to have to live in, because they inherently knew that God loved them, they loved God, and everything would be provided for them. There was an absolute freedom in that, and only we can imagine that any of us would get to that place of pure trust, where we truly know in our hearts that God loves us, we love God, and that God's going to actually provide for us everything. So that's where Claire was at. And of course, the bishops and the Pope at the time, I think it was Pope Innocent III, and they could not imagine a monastery that would be built like this. They couldn't imagine it at all. So they just, when Claire wanted to actually make a life like this for her and her sisters, she did not get any type of cooperation at the beginning from the bishops or the Pope. She persevered and persevered and persevered, and finally, on her deathbed, the rule that she wrote for her sisters and herself was approved by Pope Innocent. And I also have to say about this that she was the first woman that was ever allowed to write her own rule. Prior to that, everything that the nuns did in other monasteries like the Benedictines and the Cistercians, etc., all of these rules were written by men for women. And they were imposed upon women, and all of the regulations were imposed upon women from the bishops and the Pope, etc. Claire was the first woman who wrote her own rule, a woman for her sisters. Okay, so she was a woman that wrote her own rule for her sisters. And when you go to Assisi and she's lying there in that glass coffin, she's clutching onto that rule because it meant so much for her. It was the whole total charism and the whole total meaning behind Franciscanism. Poverty, and it wasn't poverty for poverty's sake to be poor. It was poverty in the sense that you had a total trust and love of God, and God had a total love given back to you and a trust of you as well. So that was the hallmark, and that is really the cornerstone of Franciscanism. Okay, it's the trust and the love of God. Now, I also want to say too, because Claire and Francis wanted to emulate Jesus Christ, they also wanted to have a solidarity with the poor. And it's interesting to note that San Damiano, the convent or the monastery eventually that Claire wound up in and spent the rest of her life in, that was actually built initially by St. Francis, or restored by St. Francis. It is outside of the city, outside of the walls of the city of Assisi. Now that's really significant, and it's significant because in the walls of the city were the rich people, which were the nobility and the merchant class. They were protected, they engaged in commerce, etc. Outside of the walls of the city were the poor people. They were the people who, were not engaging in any commerce, who really didn't have protection, really nobody cared about. They were apart from society. They were looked down upon. They were the servants. They were the servants of the merchants and the nobility. Also, I have to say that when Claire established her rule, anybody who came into her monastery, didn't matter who you were, she didn't see you as a noble person, didn't see you as a merchant class, didn't see you as a poor person. All that she cared about is before you entered, you gave everything up. You gave away all your possessions. You came to that convent door with nothing, that monastery door with nothing. And once you got inside, you were equal with everyone else, which, as I said, in Benedictine convents and Cistercian convents and other ones established before her, that wasn't the case. You came in as a noblewoman, you stayed a noblewoman, and you had servants. The poor women that came in were the servants of the nobility. When you came into the monastery of St. Clare, you were a total equal. There were no servants. Everybody did work. And in her rule it says that you need to do work with your hands. Everybody should have an assignment where they work with their hands. For the nobility and the merchant class, this was unheard of. You never dirtied your hands. You never worked with your hands. Everybody did everything for you. So this was also to have a solidarity with the poor, and thus with Christ, who was poor. Okay, so she wanted to emulate Christ this way. So Christ worked with his hands, so her sisters were going to work with their hands. They did everything to provide for themselves. They were self-sufficient. There was actually sisters who went out and begged for food, which would be totally unheard of and totally looked down upon in the feudal society that Clare lived in. There would be no nobility or merchant class ever going out to beg for food. That would be totally disgraceful and unheard of. But this is what she encouraged her sisters to do, so that they also would have a solidarity with the poor. The other thing is that they took care of the poor. They took care of whoever came to their door. They shared food with whoever came to their door, no matter who it was. They tried to help and heal people who came to them. There are many records of Clare actually healing others. So this was something that we have to look at also, that Clare and her sisters were very much in solidarity with all of the poor people. They lived outside of the city as a symbol of being with the poor. And they certainly separated themselves from the rich class that they were in prior to her establishment of this order. So we see that she had this radical poverty. This is something that she begged for from the Pope, to take her rule and make it a rule which would have a radical poverty in it. It meant that they would never be obliged, the sisters would never be obliged to actually own property. They would never be obliged to have to pay rent. There would be, if they had a place that they lived, it would be freely given to them. So this is how they lived. They lived knowing that God would provide for them, that God would just totally meet all of their needs, and that God was in love with them as much as they were in love with God. So they lived by the work of their hands. They might have done embroidery or something like that they would give to somebody else in exchange for possibly food or whatever. And if they gave it as a gift to somebody and the person didn't want to give them anything, then that was okay too. There was no expectation. The only expectation, as I said, would be that God would provide. That was the only expectation. And that wasn't even an expectation either. It was just simply a total surrender. We talk so many times about total surrender in the Teo community, that we surrender ourselves over to God. That's what we strive for. We say that with our mouths, and we say that with our hearts. But total surrender is a day-to-day thing. It's a day-to-day manifestation. It's day-to-day revelation of how to surrender, how to trust, how to love. With Clare, it seemed to happen immediately with her conversion. Both Clare and Francis are two radical beings that kind of set the stage for us to be the same. As I said, their lives were extreme, but their lives needed to be extreme in order to get followers, in order to be a beacon for the rest of us, to be beacons of light so that we would be able to see them and follow them in our own lives and take their rule and make it our own. And I have to say that there's only a few rules of life. It seems like there's many orders of nuns, and there's many orders of priests and brothers, but there's only about 5 rules of life that actually have been approved by the Roman Catholic Church. And Franciscanism is one of them. As I said, you have the rule of St. Benedict, you have the rule of St. Francis, you have the rule of St. Dominic, you have a couple others. But these 5 are the only 5 rules that actually have been approved by the Roman Catholic Church, which means that they see these rules as viable ways of living the life of Jesus Christ as professed in the Gospels. So when you see other orders, and you see different orders, and they have all different names and whatever, they're all following a certain rule. They're following a rule of St. Francis, or they're following a rule of St. Benedict, etc., maybe tweaked a little bit differently, okay, to fit their lifestyle. Okay, because the rule of St. Francis and the rule of St. Benedict, etc., are all basic, but you take them and incorporate them into your life and make them your own. As we do in the Teo community, we take the rule of St. Francis and make this our own. It's all according to how it's interpreted for you. We all can't be radical St. Francis's, we all can't be radical St. Clare's, but we can take their life and incorporate it into the life that we live on a daily basis. So this is the basis of the poverty that Clare talks about. And as I said, when I first looked at the poverty, I used to think, poverty, the poverty of St. Clare, you know, how is this, you know, beneficial in a lot of ways? But when you look at it from the eyes of love, and you look at it through the eyes of St. Clare, you see it in a different light. You see it as the love relationship that it truly is. So we need to really, on this journey with Clare, we need to really look at things through the eyes of St. Clare. We have to see her mindset. We have to look at things as she would look at things. And then when we do that, we can see different ways in our own lives that we can make her ideals our own. When you really truly look at her, you get past all of the bookwork and all of the things that were written about her, and you sit with her and you contemplate what she was about and how she lived. Then you can take what she had as sacred to her and look at that and make it your own. As I said, you can look at what surrender means to you, what poverty means to you, what the love of God means to you, what being in a relationship, a love relationship with God means to you. And this is what really journeying with Clare is all about. It's all about love. It's all about relationship. And out of that springs everything else that she did in life. Everything springs out, like her courage, her love of the Eucharist, her love of her sisters, the poverty, the prayer, the fasting. All of that comes out of a love relationship with God. So we need to really sit down and look at that. We can always look at saints, and we can always, listen to what they have to say in a superficial manner, and that's good too. But if you really want to transform your life, as Clare says, she wanted to transform her life into God, you have to really sit down and contemplate and sit with these saints. Have some quiet time, some silence, where you can just sit and ask, what does this mean to me? What does this poverty mean to me? What did this poverty mean to you, Clare? What was this all about? And see what answers that you receive. If you do that even to the next time that we meet with each other on next Tuesday, maybe you'll have some answers for yourself. If you do, I'd love for you to share them with me on the chat board. You don't have to. I mean, if it's very personal, you don't have to do that. But I'd love for us to have dialogue that way if we could. But at any rate, if not, just sit with Clare and be with her. And maybe the two of you can sit there and contemplate God together and see what answers you receive. So I'd like to finish now with another prayer of St. Clare's. And before the prayer, I do want to have this a quote for you. And this is a quote from her. It is a source and inspiration of her life and her sisters. Out of love for the God who was placed poor in the crib, lived poor as in the world, and remained naked on the cross, may the Lord always have his little flock, which the Lord Father has begotten in his holy church, by the word and example of our blessed Father Francis, by following the poverty and humility of his beloved Son and his glorious Virgin Mother. Observe the holy poverty that we have promised to God and our most blessed Father, St. Francis, and may he always encourage and support them in these things, meaning the sisters. And now I just want to end with, as I said, a prayer of hers. May I always rejoice in you, O Lord, and never allow a cloud of bitterness to surround me. Teach me to keep my eyes on you, who are the mirror of eternity, that which does not change and remains forever. May my soul rest in the splendor of your glory, and may my heart remain in you, because to see you is to see the Father. You who made yourself like me, make me like you, and may my life be open to the joy of loving and being loved. Amen. So thank you so much for being here and for being with me in this journey with Claire. And hopefully we'll see each other next Tuesday around the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard and 8 p.m. GMT. So may God bless you, may Claire and Francis bless you, and may you have the joy and peace of God. Thank you again. Namaste.